What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Armored Core 6, the latest title from Software that features a lot of grandiose mech battles. Now, I do confess at the start of this video, I don't know a terribly large amount about the Armored Core series as a whole, which is why I wasn't initially planning to cover it much, but upon mentioning that, a lot of people mentioned that they would like the perspective of someone who also hasn't played these games to know if they should try it out themselves. Because chances are, with this being From Software's first Armored Core game in about 10 years, following all of the success of their various Souls-like games, a lot of people are jumping into this for the first time, myself included. But with that out of the way, let's actually talk about this game. So, story-wise, I would say the setup is interesting, but the execution is a little wanting. The game lets us know that we are crash landing, basically, on a planet known as Rubicon, that we are not supposed to be on. We are there illegally, so we can take up work for the various corporations and get access to coral. Coral is a resource that is used for basically everything, more or less our MacGuffin for the plot here, as it is essentially this sort of wondrous super material that everybody wants. And naturally, for corporations, that means tearing the place apart to get it, despite the fact that this substance has been known to cause a disaster or two previously, which honestly by itself is a very interesting setup. It is intriguing the way this is presented. However, I will say the game goes on to tell its story basically just through the occasional message and sort of text display in between missions, which is a bit uninspired. However, before we dive into the details of said missions, once you clear the tutorial, which can be a little bit of a challenge, but we'll talk about that, you can get into the game's other mechanics, such as building and customizing your own AC, or your mech. And unsurprisingly, in a game that pretty much focuses on mech battles, this part is really well done. The first chapter of the game, you're a little bit limited in what you can add, but by the time you get to chapter 2, you can really mix and match a bunch of stuff. Though generally speaking, every mech is made up of 4 attack slots. These are various weapons you can slot onto the mech's shoulders and arms, and then a variety of body parts and other upgrades that make up the mech's stats, as well as how it actually plays. You can customize all of that. There is a visual part to this as well that will see you customizing the paint job, all that usual stuff you might expect, and it's a ton of fun. Assembling your AC is basically this game's version of a build though, so that's something to keep in mind. There are a lot of big heavy parts that will grant you a bunch of defense and extra health at the expense of your movement, which can help or hinder you in certain situations. Other mech parts will grant you a ton of movement and mobility at the expense of being a bit of a glass cannon and easier to kill. Basically the usual stuff, and this includes all of our different weapon slots, kind of dictating the appropriate range at which for you to attack, as there are melee weapons even. And most of what I messed around with here was a good, I would say, mid-range build. I would essentially use missiles and a rifle until my melee weapon was off of cooldown, at which point I would swing that and try to stagger the enemy, just to give an example of something you can try to do here. But with that in mind, let's talk about the crux of this game, which is to say the missions themselves. It is a mission-based system. In between missions, you're basically just in menus dealing with various things like your mech, but once you pick a mission to go on, you'll get a briefing of sorts giving you information about what it is you're doing, which side of this conflict that you happen to be working on, in this particular instance, as you will kind of be playing all sides, before dropping you into it. At which point your goal is to typically take out targets in as an efficient manner as possible. Some things to keep in mind while we talk about this, though, is that while each mission will reward you with cash, you will take a little bit of a penalty to that based on the damage you take, that is to say the repair kits you wind up using, and the ammo you use. These are not huge penalties. Even in missions where I didn't do very well, I was still more than in the green, so to speak, but you will earn more money the better you perform. Now, combat itself, or running around the missions in general, is at first glance pretty much what you would expect. You can move around pretty quickly and freely, enabling your ability to boost and sort of fly up with your rockets, which costs a little bit of energy, again based on your stats here, as you take out generic enemies. The smaller run-of-the-mill enemies aren't really much of a threat. They go down pretty quickly and they're only really dangerous in groups, so a lot of missions can be a bit of a hack and slash until you get to your target or a bigger boss-like enemy. though you do have to watch out for things like rocket launchers and artillery shooting at you, because those can deal more substantial damage, but even they kind of just crumple when you get up to them. But getting to them can pose a bit of a challenge in certain instances, which again is all kind of dependent on your build really. When you inevitably take damage, you'll have 3 repair kits you can use. When you run out of these, that's pretty much it, that's all you get. Though some missions are long enough that they warrant a resupply here and there, which is just a point on the level you interact with. Otherwise, you won't get them back unless you are destroyed. If you're destroyed, you can just restart from a checkpoint. There's not really any penalty for it. You just try again, basically. Now, where things get a little more complicated is the boss enemies. Already, I've seen a lot of online chatter about the difficulty of the first boss at the end of the initial tutorial mission. I gotta be honest, I didn't really struggle with this that much. I beat it on the second try. However, I don't think it's a well-designed boss. Not so much because of its attacks or anything it does, but because when this boss gets summoned in, this sort of attack helicopter, you're sort of locked into this small square area that you have to fight this thing in. There's limited cover, it's shooting rockets and everything at you. You're probably still trying to get to grips with the controls even. So I can see how someone would have a little bit of a rough time here, but what makes this genuinely more annoying than it should be in my opinion is that the helicopter can actually fly outside of the arena that you are trapped in. So there were multiple times where I was trying to hit the thing, but then it would just sort of fly just outside of the range I was allowed to go, while also getting a ton of cheap shots in as a result. So I don't really think this is a great first tutorial boss, especially since they give you the actual proper tutorial like training stuff right after this, which is a bizarre decision. However, I will say after that, bosses and mini bosses did get a lot more interesting as you get more equipment and more options. The boss at the end of chapter 1, I believe, called the Juggernaut, has to be attacked from behind in order for you to do any real damage to it. There was also a mission where you're technically fighting a giant walking mech called the Strider while a mining laser is shooting at you. You're being attacked by enemies. You got to take out its generators and then the laser itself. And stuff like that was really cool. So I do think this game handles the big enemies in a much more satisfying way than the little ones. But I do acknowledge there is some room for frustration there. However, a lot of what goes into this is your mech and how you've customized it, once you, of course, get to the point where you actually can. However, regardless of the playstyle that that's going to enable, probably the most important thing it took me a second to realize was that every enemy has a sort of stagger bar that fills up as you hit them. And once you fill that up, they will be stunned for a moment and take increased damage. And while that makes no difference for little enemies, of course, larger boss enemies, this made a huge difference. And once I had kind of figured that out, the gameplay got a lot better, especially since the controls are themselves pretty straightforward. They feel surprisingly intuitive for as much as there is going on screen, so to speak. Ultimately, though, once you get the hang of the movement and the controls, it can get to a point where you're having a lot of fun, or at least that was the case for me. But to sort of sum up here towards the end, I think the story has an interesting premise, but it is told in a sort of lackluster way. I think the combat and the mech customization is a ton of fun, more than I was expecting it to be honest. If you can get past a little bit of, I would say, frustrating conveyance at the beginning, where I don't think they tutorialize you very well, which honestly is a pretty common thing from software, if I'm being real. I will say that I can see what people enjoy about this game. But at the same time, I do have to admit, it does feel a little bit one note, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's not really much exploration in terms of the levels. There's not much going on. You basically find and shoot down other mechs. Sometimes you can fight extra optional ones that will give you a bonus of sorts, which can lead to you getting extra parts for your mech, etc. But that's really about it. Though I do understand there's like an arena mode and some amount of multiplayer options to potentially help freshen up that gameplay experience. So in fairness, I haven't seen everything the game has to offer here. So at least for now, all I can really say is that I really enjoyed what I played of it, more so than I was expecting. However, I do still have a couple of reservations that honestly only playing this some more would really tell me about one way or the other. And I am neck deep in a Starfield review right now that I can't really talk about outside of saying that I'm I'm doing a Starfield review, so it'll be a little while before I get a chance to mess with this anymore, though truth be told, I liked it so much that I might actually play this one more. So while it won't be soon, you might actually get a review out of me on this one anyways. For now, that's pretty much my thoughts on it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about it down in the comments section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.